Hi guys, welcome to Caterpillar Cross Stitch. Today we are providing you with a beginner's guide to cross stitch. Starting a new hobby can be quite overwhelming, and so today the guide will provide you with a good understanding of all the elements you need to know about cross stitching to get you on track with starting your cross stitching journey. We are going to be looking at a variety of things today, from starting your project to ending the thread in your fabric. If you're new around here, hi, my name is Sian, and here on this channel we upload regular cross stitch related videos, from how-to guides, tips and tricks, and even new announcements of new stitch alongs that Sally, the designer and owner of Caterpillar Cross Stitch, is releasing. If you haven't already, we would love for you to hit the subscribe button and join the community and hit that notification bell so that you don't miss out on any future uploads. So let's jump right in and let's take a look at the main things you need when cross stitching. So here we have all different things that we need when we are stitching. So we have our pattern, we have some fabrics, we have some aida and some even weave. We have our needle, some thread, pair of scissors and some frames. So let's break it down so we can see exactly what we have and why we need it. So if you are a complete beginner, a great place to start is to start with a kit, because the kit has everything you need except for a frame and a pair of scissors. So on the Caterpillar Cross Stitch kits, you can see how big the design is going to be, what's inside. So as you can see, we have our Got fabric, our DMC cotton, our DMC needle, printed colour chart and full instructions, and everything within the kit is everything that you need. And within this kit there is also the added bonus of a needle minder, which I will go into shortly. And as part of the kit you'd get some instructions and your pattern. Now in this video we're not going to be going into too much detail on how to read a pattern. There is going to be a video coming shortly, so make sure you have your notifications turned on so you get notified when that is available. Okay, let's move on to our frames. So the first one is a hoop. This is a 7-inch hoop and they come in different sizes. So as you can see, there's a smaller one here, and hoops are really great if you want to finish them and display them. These small ones are quite popular for ornament finishes. And how they work is they come in two parts. So you have a smaller part, which is the bottom part, and then you have this bigger hoop, which then has this screw on the top, which allows you to make the hoop smaller or bigger. These are great if you are wanting to hold your stitching in your hand, as they are quite light compared to frames such as the Q-snap. And so these are great if you want to hold your fabric in your hands. We then have the Q-snap, which has these clamps on each of the sides, and these are what are used to clamp your fabric down and to hold your fabric down. You can also turn them, which then allows you to have more tension in your fabric, and they also do come apart as well, so you can actually make them bigger with some of the brands available. So they are the two frames that are commonly used in cross stitching. My personal preference is the Q-snap, as I have a Lowry stand, so the clamp works a lot better on the Q-snap, but hoops are also very popular in the community. We then have some embroidery scissors. Now we would recommend embroidery scissors because they are a lot sharper, and these are actually Caterpillar Cross Stitch scissors, which come in different colours, and they are super sharp, which is what you need when you are wanting to cut some thread. So I'm just going to show you how sharp they are. They cut super clean through the thread, which when you are trying to thread your thread into the needle, you want it to be clean and sharp and crisp on the edging, as that really does help when trying to thread your thread onto the needle. So a good pair of scissors is what you need, and yeah, you want them to be nice and sharp, just like these caterpillar cross stitch scissors. We then have our cotton. Now this is a DMC branded cotton. This is a very popular cotton in cross stitching, but there are other brands available. And how DMC works is they have their own unique identification number, and this allows you to know what colour you are using. So if we have a look at a DMC colour key in one of the kits, you can see that there is a unique number for each of the colours. And so this number you would see in your colour key, so you know that that symbol equals the colour. Now this is not part of this DMC colour, but hopefully you understand what I mean. We then have a needle, and you want to use a tapestry needle as you don't want the ends to be super sharp. And if you're using a 14 count fabric, which is what we would recommend for a beginner, you would want a size 24, and all the needles used in the caterpillar cross stitch kits are DMC branded. Just move them out of the way. So moving on to our fabrics, we have two different types of fabrics here to show you. We have Aida, which you can see the squares, it looks more of a gridded fabric. And then we have our evenweave, which, as you can see, the squares are a lot harder to see. And we would recommend that if you are a beginner that you would start on Aida, and once you really find your feet and start to become really comfortable, then you can try one of the evenweaves or the linens. So they are all of the things that you would need for stitching. Now the other thing that we would recommend is a needle minder. And so these are a great little tool as they look after your needle. So essentially how these work is you take your fabric, and they have a little magnet on the back, and you can secure that in place on your fabric, as you can see, and then you can then add your needle, and it looks after your needle, so you don't have to worry about your needle being lost. And they are a great little tool to have in your cross stitching. So now that we have seen everything that we really need to use, let's break it down and let's see how we actually start our project. So to remove our thread from the skein, I like to pull from the bottom end of the DMC skein, which has the unique number side. As you can see, there is a little tail hanging out here, and I find it better to pull from this side instead of the other side. So all I do is I pull out, I hold the DMC in my left hand, and then I pull out using my right hand until I reach a certain length. Now the recommended length is the size from the tip of your finger to your elbow. That's a really good length to use, because if you have it too big, then it can start to become quite difficult to work with. But if you also have it too short, then you will constantly be ending your thread and starting the process again. So I like to hold my thread. I like to use the same length as my arm. So as you can see, that is the same length as my arm. And so that is where I will cut my thread, and then it will be the perfect size for my stitching. DMC thread is made up of 6 strands. So I'm going to see if I can show you the 6 strands. So as you can see, there are 6 different strands here in this thread. Now, depending on the design and depending on the count size that you have in your fabric, it could determine the different amounts of strands that you need. But for today's example, we are going to be using 2 strands in our 14 count Aida fabric. Now, to separate the strands from the thread, I like to pull one strand out at a time. So I like to separate the strands out, find one of the strands, and using my left hand, I like to just pinch the thread and just create some tension on the thread, and then pull the strand out. And as you can see, the thread will start to remove, and don't worry about the strands on the left clumping up like that, as once we have pulled out the strand, run our hands over the strands and it will be back to normal. So we'll do that again. So we'll do the process again. So pull out using your right hand, or if you use your left hand, you can do it either way, but I'm right-handed, so I like to use my right hand. And I'm going to keep tension on this side on the thread, but not too much so that it doesn't allow me to actually pull my strand out. So I'm going to gently pull out my strand, and as you can see, the threads are then going to start to clump up, but we don't need to worry about it, because once we have our strand out, we can then run our hands over the thread, and you can see it is back to normal. We have our 2 strands that we need to start cross stitching. So the first one I'm going to show you is adding a knot to the bottom of your thread. So to do that, I'm going to wrap the thread around my finger, and then I'm going to push the little tail into the circular loop, and then pull my tail through, and then pull the 2 ends together to create a knot. I'm going to do that again to create a bigger knot, because we want the knot to be big enough to stop the thread from pulling through from the back to the front. Now that we have our knot on the end of our thread, we're now going to push our thread through the eye of the needle. Now there are little tools that you can use to help with this part, but essentially I find just twisting the thread can help, as it can flatten it, or you can cut the thread to make it crisp as well. I always find that really helps. But like I said, you can get little tools to help with that. So I thought I would show you how a Q-snap works. So I'm going to take these clasps off, take them off the frame, and then I'm going to lay my frame down. I'm going to open my fabric, and then I'm going to lay my fabric down on the frame. And then taking the clasps, and then going to push the clasp down onto the frame, and I'm going to do that on all 4 sides. And then I'm going to just move the clasp outwards, and then this now has created a really good tension in my fabric, which will really help when stitching, as you want your fabric to have some form of tension, especially at the beginning when you're a beginner, as it does help with making sure that all of your stitches will look neat and tidy. So now that we have our fabric in our square and we have our needle and our thread ready to go, we're now going to start our first cross stitch. So I like to start in the top left of the square. Now it doesn't really matter where you start. It doesn't matter where you start. You can start in the bottom right, you can start in the top left. It doesn't matter until you add your first stitch, but we'll go into that once we have added our first cross stitch. So I'm going to push my needle up through the top left of this square. I'm going to pull the thread through until I feel some tension on the thread. So as you can see, it's now stopping at this point, and that's because our little knot is now doing its job. So when I pull through, it is stopping the thread from coming all the way through. So once I have reached this part, I'm then going to go diagonally down into the bottom right hole. And then I'm going to pull my thread through until I feel tension again on the needle. So that is the first leg of our stitching, and this is called a half stitch. I'm then going to go back up in the top right of the square, and I'm going to repeat the process again. So I'm going to pull the thread back up till I get tension, and then I'm going to go back down in the left, bottom left, and pull the thread through. And then we have our first cross stitch. So we'll take a look at the back. As you can see, the knot has kept the thread in place, and we now have our first cross stitch. Now, the bottom leg was running from the top left to the bottom right, or it can be the bottom right to the top left. But the main thing to remember is whichever way your bottom leg runs, it needs to stay the same way throughout the whole of the project. So we need to make sure that our stitches run this way throughout, but you can go from the top left to bottom right, you can go from the bottom right to top left. As you can see, I'm changing the different ways that I am stitching, and the main thing is that that bottom leg runs the same way. So then if we go to put our top stitch on the top, we'll go from the top right to the bottom left, or we can go from the bottom left to the top right. It doesn't matter. The main thing is that our top stitches all run the same way. So there we have the knot method. So now that we have our 4 stitches, we now need to end our thread. So to do this, I like to run my needle on through the back of the stitches that I have already put in place. So I'm going to run my thread through the back and pull my thread through. Then I'm going to take my scissors and cut the thread, and then we have our first set of stitches. The next method is called the loop method, and this one works slightly different to the knot method because we need twice as much thread than what we did for the knot method. So we need to use the same reference with our arm, but we need to do it twice. And the reason for that is because we're only going to use 1 strand instead of 2, and we're going to fold it in half. We're going to take the 2 ends and we're going to put them together. So we now have 2 ends here, but now at the end we have a loop. So we have a loop and we have our 2 ends. So I'm going to come up from the back in the top left of the square, and I'm going to pull my thread through until there is a couple of inches of loop on the back. And then I'm going to push my needle back down in the bottom right, and then I'm going to take my needle, I'm going to push it through the back and hook the hoop and pull my thread through. And then this will secure my thread in place. So as you can see, that is now secure in place. And then I'm going to continue to stitch my 4 squares to show you what it looks like on the back. Now I just want to briefly talk about the count and what it means. So we're currently stitching on 14 count Aida, and that means that there are 14 stitches within an inch. So because we're stitching over 1 fibre, which equals 1 square, we are going to have 14 stitches within the inch. So if you had a 16 count Aida, you'd have 16 stitches. If you had 18 count Aida, then you'd have 18 stitches. So that's what the count means with regards to Aida. Now it's slightly different for evenweave, and we'll cover that when we move to the evenweave section, but when you're looking at Aida and you're seeing the different counts, that is what it means. Okay, so we now have our 4 stitches in place. So let's take a look at the back. So as you can see, we now have our 4 stitches in place on the back as well. So I'm now going to run my needle through the back of the stitches to secure the thread in place, and then I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to cut the thread, and there we have our 2 different methods. Now you can see on the back there is a bit of a difference between the 2. I personally prefer the loop method as I think it keeps the back the neatest, but there are other methods out there that other stitchers prefer to use. So it really is down to personal preference, but they are the 2 methods that you can use to start your cross stitching. So we now have our fabric and we have our hoop. So the smaller part needs to go on the bottom. So we're going to place our hoop on the bottom, and then we're going to place our fabric on the top, and then we're going to open our hoop a little bit, and then we're going to push down on our fabric. As you can see, and then we're going to pick it up, and then we're just going to tighten the hoop to make sure that we have some good tension in our fabric. So this is what it's going to look like. You can also pull the fabric out a little bit around the edges to make sure that it's sitting nice. And so we now have our hoop and our fabric ready to go. When comparing it to Aida, Aida looks very similar to your pattern in that it's gridded. You know, we have these lots of different squares, and each square represents the grid on your pattern. And each of the squares has 4 holes, and it is really easy to see and read. Whereas evenweave is a lot different in that instead of having 4 holes per square, you have 9. And so how we stitch on evenweave is we are going to take one of the holes and we're going to pull our thread through, and I'm going to use the loop method in this example. So where we would normally have 4 holes in a square, we now have 9. So we have the hole that I'm in, we have a middle hole, and then we have the square corner hole. So when we are counting, we want to count to 2. So we have 1, which is the middle one, then we have 2, which is the square. And it's the same going diagonal. So we have 1, which is in the middle of the square, and then we have 2, which is the bottom corner. So when we are stitching, we count 1, 2. So then we pull our thread through, and I'm going to catch the loop at the back, and I'm going to pull my thread through. So now we have our first leg of the square. So because I finished down here at the bottom right, I'm then going to count vertically up to 2. So I'm going to go 1, which is this one here, which is the middle hole, and then I'm going to count to 2, which is this hole here. And I'm going to pull my thread through, and then I'm going to go diagonally again, 1, which is the middle, and then 2, which is the bottom left. And then we have our stitch. So I'm going to do that again. Now with regards to the count for evenweave, we're currently stitching on a 28 count evenweave. So that means that if you were to stitch over 1 fibre of the fabric, there would be 28 stitches within the inch. But because we're stitching over 2 fibres, we then half the number because we're stitching over 2 squares, which then means you go from a 28 count to a 14 count equivalent. So then you'd have 14 stitches within an inch, which then makes it the equivalent of the 14 count Aida. But because we're stitching over 2 fibres, we then half the number because we're stitching over 2 squares, which then means you go from a 28 count to a 14 count equivalent. So then you'd have 14 stitches within an inch, which then makes it the equivalent of the 14 count Aida. So here I'm going to change direction so I can show you. So we're going to count 1, 2, and that's the start of my bottom right. Then I'm going to count up 1, 2. So I'm going to go diagonally 2. Then I'm going to go across 1, 2. And then I'm going to go back down diagonally into this bottom left corner. So it does work slightly different to our Aida, because Aida has 1 fibre per square, whereas evenweave has 2 fibres per square for the equivalent of Aida. Now, when working on a 14 count Aida, to get the same stitch size on evenweave, you double the number. So this is a 28 count evenweave, which is the equivalent of 14 count Aida. Now you can stitch each individual square on evenweave, but it would make the design very, very small. So if you wanted to stitch 1 fibre at a time, you can, but it makes the stitch super small. Whereas when trying to get the same size as a 14 count Aida, you want to stitch over 2 squares to get the same size. There is a really good detailed video here on caterpillar cross stitch. We will leave it linked down below so you can get more information about the different counts and the different fabrics that you can stitch on. So there we have our beginner's guide to cross stitching. Now we hope this video has provided you with a good understanding to give you that confidence to start on your cross stitching journey. We would encourage you to go and check out the Caterpillar Cross Stitch Facebook group, where you can connect with other stitchers and really feel part of a community. There is also a Caterpillar Cross Stitch newsletter where you can gain instant access to Sally's freebie designs if you sign up to the newsletter. I think this is a really good place to start, especially if you are new to cross stitching. So that's it from us here at Caterpillar Cross Stitch. Thank you so much for watching. And until next time, we'll see you in the next one.